You know, it's not all that common today to hear someone praise Squaresoft's 7th main entry in the Final Fantasy series. As a matter of fact, you're more likely to stumble upon harsh criticism. Yeah, it seems like FF7 has hit that peak when a property slips from being popular to being overrated. Well, for those of us who grew up in the era before 7, there's a very different story to tell. Final Fantasy VII was the beginning of a new era for us, an era of RPGs hitting the mainstream and easily the most prolific period the genre has ever seen. But when I take a look back on it, I find it's hard to quantify what exactly turned these 3 discs into a worldwide phenomena. So today I want to show a little reverence by analyzing the impact of one of the most important Japanese role-playing games since Dragon Quest. However, before we kick this thing off, I think it's important to mention that none of the things on this list are beholden to this game alone, and by no means is this a declaration of fact. These are my own feelings on the subject. But regardless of whether or not you agree, get in that comment section and let me know what made this game great for you, or what didn't. Oh, and we're definitely going to be getting into spoiler territory, so fair warning. Well, with that all out of the way, let's discuss 3 ways Final Fantasy VII changed RPGs forever. By no means was FF7 the first to ditch the medieval swords and sorcery backdrop we're all used to, but given the almost limitless space afforded to Square by the PS1 CD format, I think this was the best it had ever been pulled off. Almost every area in the game furthered this dystopian mix of early history and rundown cyberpunk city planning. And I loved seeing little touches like what you would assume is a normal wooden house, only to find parts of the wall showcasing exposed metal reinforcements and a rat's nest of cables and lights. The world of Final Fantasy VII felt like a place that had at one point achieved a great level of technology, but somehow was drifting further and further from it. Most of the tech you come across is in disrepair or rusted just enough to show that it only recently had gotten this way. To have a game be able to tell a compelling story through its environment was still a new phenomenon, and 7 was a shining example of it. But looks aren't everything. You also have to consider how consistent 7 was with this modern, almost real-world setting. In any other Final Fantasy game, getting a nail bat for a weapon or using a grenade from your inventory would have been a cool little nod to the real world, but in 7, these things truly fit with the game world. Instead of facing off against a king gone mad with power, you bomb the power reactors of an electrical company who has a monopoly on energy distribution. Every part of this game mirrors the rest of it. You're essentially a modern eco-terrorist, and your enemy is a multi-billion-dollar company. In this kind of setup, most of the aspects about RPGs that require a suspension of disbelief can be logically explained away. Airships exist because the technology to fly into space has already been achieved. Guns can be used because we're fighting in an office building with cubicle dividers. But the most genius use of this method was the explanation of magic in this world. No longer were mages or summoners needed because magic came from the same place that kept the lights on in Midgar. Having materia act as a sort of magical byproduct of Mako energy cultivation blew the doors off any other game's attempt at a fully realized world. From here on out, we weren't magicians shooting lightning out of our wands. We were gun-toting extremists holding nuclear material that affected the elements and biology. This was such a small part of the game, but it was so essential to achieving this feel, like a small puzzle piece that links together a cohesive experience. Without one of these tiny elements, the realistic and modern feel of the game may not have existed, and without it, I think games as a whole would have suffered greatly. It's important to point out that a game being popular doesn't necessarily make it great. I mean, I don't think anyone's ready to declare Call of Duty is the greatest game ever made. Well, maybe this guy. But there's something more than just popularity with the masses that made FF7 such a game changer. In fact, I think there are 2 distinct differences between 7 and other greats in the RPG world, chief among them being its huge advertising push. Now, I know most of you wouldn't bat an eye at seeing video game trailers in your TV programming, but believe it or not, there was a time when game commercials were almost non-existent. Now add that to the fact that we were seeing footage of a role-playing game in between episodes of Third Rock from the Sun, and you can probably imagine what a strange time the late 90s were. Okay, so Square decided to put a lot of money into promoting this game. So how does that make 7 special? Well, even though I could go on and on about how cool it was seeing my favorite underground genre being represented in the mainstream, what's most important is the result of these advertisements. Final Fantasy VII ended up being the second highest grossing game on the PlayStation, and I don't know how good your math is, but RPG gamers don't even have a fraction of that kind of buying power. And that's what made 7 special, the fact that people who had never even played an RPG were jumping into the genre head first. Games like first-person shooters or casual affairs like Angry Birds have proven that they possess some kind of an eerie universal appeal, and almost anyone can get into these types of games. RPGs, however, well, they've never been what you would call largely popular, especially in the years before 7 launched. But all the same, there was a copy of this game sitting in most households that owned a PS1. I myself experienced this phenomenon firsthand when hanging out with one of my teammates on the school football team. This was the kind of guy who treated games as a fun activity when he was bored, and never struck me as an RPG fan, but sure enough, there was a copy of the game sitting right there in his bedroom. I asked him what drove him to buy this kind of game, and he said, "Oh, that? Yeah, it's really good." But subjective experiences aside, Final Fantasy VII was one of the first RPGs to bridge the divide between us and the mainstream gamers. So no matter how you feel about how 7 plays or about its story, the fact of the matter is, there's a chance that your favorite RPG would have never existed without the immense popularity of Final Fantasy VII. If you've spent any amount of time with RPGs, you've no doubt lost a main character to a tragic death. Having a party member who you may have emotionally invested in taken out can always lead to a greater sense of impact in a game, and I think we all know that 7 didn't exactly invent this concept, but it did come up with something just a little bit deeper. In Final Fantasy VII, everyone from Cloud to the NPCs in the Sector 7 slums have all experienced a great loss. They've all went through the kind of emotional trauma that we went through watching Aeris's lifeless body fall to the floor, and I think this game hits a much more specific emotional chord because of it. Meeting Cid Highwind was a fun introduction to a foul-mouthed old guy, but when we find out the source of his anger, the fact that his whole life led up to a space mission that could now never come, this aging hothead became a much more relatable, interesting character. And every person you come across in the game has a similar story to tell, whether it's Barrett with his wife and arm, or Vincent with his humanity. Everyone Cloud comes in contact with has experienced some kind of deep traumatizing loss, and for me, they're much more memorable for it. This focus on the effects of loss and different methods for coping with it are no accident, and sadly, mere real-life events during the game's conception. Head writer and director Hironobu Sakaguchi was well on the way to creating a fun detective story in the early days of Final Fantasy VII's creation. But then suddenly, Sakaguchi lost his mother, and this is when 7 turned into the game that we all know today. Instead of creating something that just allowed him to wallow in his sadness, I think Sakaguchi used 7's development as an interactive coping mechanism. The inclusion of a theme of loss was the first and most depressing step, but then we learn of the life stream and how death isn't the end for the people of this planet. Instead of ceasing to exist, your energy is distributed through the planet and becomes something new. It's my belief that this game would not have affected the world in such a way had these events not happened. Playing through 7 almost feels like a process one goes through after losing someone. At first there's sadness and desolation in Midgar's slums, but then there's the realization of reality with Cloud's unaltered memories. Then finally there's the fight to overcome when Meteor threatens the world. Sakaguchi's use of loss and acceptance made sure that 7 would remain one of the greatest stories ever told in a game, and I think without these sad beginnings, we would find ourselves in a very different gaming world today. Well guys, thanks for stopping by. If you have any feelings on the subject, let them out here in the comment section. I'm genuinely interested to see what you guys think. And if you're new here, maybe check out some more game analysis types of videos by clicking here. And if you liked what you saw, try slamming that subscribe button. There are definitely worse things to do with your free time than watching my content. Although, now that I think about it, there's not many.